Peace family, y'all know who it is. It's Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, in conjunction with Equaline Network, the Pan African Social Media Extraordinaire. We're back once again to bring you all a great show here in February, as I like to call it, Pan African History Month. And we definitely want to give a shout out and honor to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who created Negro History Week that later became Black History Month. But we're here today to actually honor the moral obligation to remember. Many of you may be aware uh, that we have a actual playlist on our channel. This series, Lessons from History, Honoring the Moral Obligation to Remember, is dedicated to honoring the moral obligation to remember our ancestors who, in intrepid contravention of the Ma'afa, displayed a consistent level of valor, faith, heroism, gallantry, spirit, and tenacity unseen throughout the world. And we want to make sure that we're always giving honor to our ancestors that came before us. As we are aware that they never forget where we came from and always cherish the bridges that brought us over. And so we definitely want to, invoke the wisdom of our ancestors. And so we're doing that in part today by honoring a slave revolt that took place 23 February 1763 in Dutch Guyana, known as the Cuffy Rebellion. And so to discuss this rebellion, we're bringing in, of course, the man, the myth, the legend, your favorite historian's favorite historian. My favorite Pan African is my Pan African big brother, none other than brother Dr. Dwayne Omawale. How you doing this evening, brother?
Doing well.
Very good, very good, very good. So, family, if you're watching, we just want to make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe button as well. Of course, as you know, you could comment, and of course, hit the Cash App, and of course, the Super Chat. Very quickly, family, we know that we haven't gone live in quite some time. We apologize for that. We've been moving across the country, but we're back and we're at it like we never left. So, Brother Dwayne, oftentimes when I talk with young children, particularly volunteering in school, even though my children are much older now, one of the things that typically would come up in conversations with young people is, why didn't we fight back? So before we dive into discussing the Kufi Rebellion, there's a number of things we could discuss as a result of the rebellion. Why is it that many young people do not believe that we fought back?
I think there's several reasons behind it. The first one, I think the more obvious one, is typically in the school system, you don't really hear too many stories of Africans actually fighting back. You don't really hear too many stories of large slave rebellions. And often the narrative that we do get in school is that African people were liberated because of the charity of some good white people. So the narrative in the United States is typically Abraham Lincoln was the great white savior, the great white liberator of African people. Similarly, in the British educational system, what Africans would be made to believe is that William Wilberforce, who was the abolitionist out of Britain, was the great white savior of Africans in the Caribbean. So the same thing in the French colonies as well. They're also, how they learned history is not that the Haitian revolutions were liberated enslaved Africans in the French colonies. It was, again, white liberators. So the education that many of our people receive is one that makes us think that our ancestors were waiting around to be liberated by the people who were enslaving them. So you don't typically hear too much about the massive slave rebellions, or if you do, it comes across very passively in the educational system. So, for example, when I was in high school, Nat Turner came up very briefly, but there wasn't much of a focus on Nat Turner. Most of the focus was on Abraham Lincoln and his role in the Civil War and abolishing slavery. So it does create the impression that our ancestors were waiting to be liberated. But I think the other aspect of that as well is we tend to think of fighting back in terms of the massive slave rebellion, such as what Nat Turner did, or the Berbice rebellion that we'll be speaking about, or Haitian Revolution. But our ancestors resisted in ways which were more covert and not as dramatic. And one example we could speak about is Africans who were in the house, the house slaves, and there's a very negative connotation that comes with that, particularly because of Malcolm X's statement. But the reality is many of the house slaves rebelled in their own ways as well, such as poisoning food. There's also, I've come across in my research, situations where enslaved Africans would rebel by pretending to be sick and just refusing to work.
Malingering, absolutely.
Yeah, so there were a number of ways that our ancestors fought back that weren't necessarily organizing, leading massive rebellions. But because when we don't know this history and it's not taught to us, it does create the perception that our ancestors didn't fight back. And it leads to very extreme situations where people people formed the conclusion that slavery was a choice.
Right. Well, yeah, that's if you're in the Kanye circle, right? And I think that's a great point. I mean, you highlight, of course, a global issue that we find amongst African people, and that is, of course, miseducation, right? We're talking about neo-colonial education or post antebellum education for Black people that did not actually prepare us to be full citizens, but also, of course, second-class citizens, and not even actually full human beings. So I definitely appreciate you discussing that. The Kufi Rebellion. It's familiar oftentimes with Amistad. Of course, Haiti gets a lot of love, and for good reason. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser. But why do we not hear much about the Kufi Rebellion in Guyana?
Well, I think part of the reason for that is in the United States, how often you hear about Caribbean history, to begin with. I think the Haitian Revolution, obviously, it's very well known because of the fact that it was successful and how influential it was. But outside of the Haitian Revolution, something that I've noticed is in the United States, particularly when it comes to African history, Pan-African history, the Caribbean, for the most part, gets left out. I think there's certain figures that do stand out. For example, Walter Rani, I think, is fairly well known in the United States as a Pan-Africanist for his book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But outside of Walter Rani, I don't really know how many people in the United States have exposure to the revolutionary history of Guyana. And I mean, it is a lengthy history. Obviously, we'll be discussing the Berbice slave uprising. There was another uprising as well that was very well known in Guyana and Demerara. So there was a lengthy history of not just slave rebellions in Guyana, but anti-colonial struggles, Pan-African involvement in the Pan-African movement as well. In Malcolm X's autobiography, he mentions going to Ghana where he met T. Ras Mukanan, who was a Guyanese Pan-Africanist. So Guyana and Africans from Guyana have definitely played a prominent role in the African liberation struggle in a number of ways. And not just, as I said, rebellion in the sense of slave rebellions and also active engagement in the political aspect of Pan-Africanism, but in scholarship as well. I'm referring to someone like George M. James, the author of Stolen Legacy, which has obviously been very influential. I have my criticisms of They Came Before Columbus, but Ivan Van Sertima in his time was also a very influential scholar of African history. So Guyana has played a very influential role in the struggles of African people in a number of ways. But as I pointed out, in the United States, I don't really know how well known it is, just because that history is not something that's really taught to most Americans, and Caribbean history as a whole isn't really something that comes up much in typical discussions of African American history.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this, because there's a lot of narratives going on right now regarding African people, Black people being indigenous to the Americas. Were the leaders of the Kufu Rebellion indigenous to Guyana, South America, or did they come from West Africa?
Most came from West Africa. Now, in the rebellion, there were some who were born in the colony, but the majority of the leaders actually came from West Africa. So, for example,
were African born. Okay.
Who are African born. So, for example, the leader, we refer to him as Cuffy in Guyana because his name has been Europeanized. But his original name was Akan Danim Kofi, because he was actually originally from West Africa, Akan man from West Africa. As I said, in Guyana we call him Cuffy, but that's not the original pronunciation of his name. So not only were the leaders of the rebellion people who actually were born in Africa, but their names actually reflected their African origin. Another leader of the uprising was Accra.
Yes, very true, very true. And so was this a successful rebellion or an unsuccessful rebellion?
So the interesting thing about that question is I think we have to, it depends on how you're defining successful. So I'll say outright, it wasn't successful in the sense that the uprising was crushed and it didn't lead to the independence that the rebels were fighting for. But why I frame my answer that way is because I think, particularly when we look at the history of slavery, it's not a situation where any one uprising or any one act of resistance was ever going to completely overturn the entire system of slavery to begin with. And even when we look at the Haitian Revolution was not the first act of resistance or rebellion in Haiti. There was a series of acts of rebellion leading up to that revolution. So for me, I would say it wasn't successful in terms of its immediate objectives, but it was successful in the sense that it did establish a tradition of resistance, particularly in the Caribbean. Ultimately, what led to the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean wasn't, as I said, it wasn't one act of rebellion, but it was just repeated acts of rebellion on the part of enslaved Africans that worried the British colonial empire enough that they realized that they had to abolish slavery sooner than they wanted, because what they wanted to avoid was a repeat of what happened in Haiti. So
Correct.
to me, it wasn't a success in terms of, as I said, immediate objectives, but it was a success in terms of the spirit of the revolution and what it indicated in terms of the possibilities of resistance on the part of African people, to the point where, to this day, Cuffy and that rebellion is something that's looked upon as a source of inspiration among Guyanese people. For example, in the United States, the way that some people look to an individual as Malcolm X as a source of inspiration, somebody that inspires our current initiatives and the work that we do. Cuffy is viewed in a similar way in Guyana, that a lot of Africans in Guyana often channel the spirit of Cuffy and channel that rebellion in the work that they're doing. So to me, I think that's a successful legacy, when you can leave behind a legacy that inspires other people to pick up that struggle and to continue that struggle.
Very good. That was my next question. I actually was going to ask it, what was the legacy? And of course, you took the question out of my mouth. So,
well, man, I could continue more on just discussing that legacy. And before
yes.
we got on the live, I was telling you about how in Guyana there's actually big monuments dedicated to that rebellion, and shows the likeness of Cuffy. And to show the importance of his legacy, that monument serves as a location for political rallies. It served as a location for mobilization. And as I said, it encapsulates the spirit of rebellion among Guyanese people, particularly African Guyanese people. So, in the history of Guyana, Cuffy is viewed as a national hero because of that uprising, and the fact that even though he wasn't immediately successful, just the fact that he dared to struggle for liberation, just the fact that he believed and envisioned that African people could be free, to me is enough to leave behind a legacy that other people can build from.
Absolutely. And so, did you learn about this rebellion formally and informally, or simply informally? How did you learn about it in Guyana?
Informally, yes, I learned about it informally. So my parents had some Guyanese currency, and just again talking about his legacy, he's on our money. So I remember looking at one of the coins, and I asked my dad, who's this man on the coin? And he said that's Cuffy, and he explained to me Cuffy led a slave uprising. So it took several years after learning who Cuffy was that I was able to come across more information to really get the details of who he was as an individual and the nature of the rebellion that he led. But my first introduction to him was informal. Like I said, it was just a matter of making an observation about the currency and asking a question about who that man on the coin was. But as I said, that's the legacy that he has in Guyana, that he's on the currency.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Why is it important that we learn about these acts of rebellion?
Like I spoke about before, there is a reason why the history of slavery is taught in a way to make us feel like our ancestors were just sitting around waiting to be liberated. And the reason why that is to paraphrase a comment that Malcolm X made, where he said, "If you could believe that you never did anything, then you'll never do anything." And by that, he meant that if you indoctrinate the people to believe that they have no historical accomplishments, they never accomplished anything, it breeds the mentality of, well, if we come from a people who've never done anything, never accomplished anything, maybe our current situation as a people, maybe our current struggles as a people is just due to the fact that this is just how we are as a people. We're people who've never done anything. We can never do anything. We always need people to come and rescue us. So the reason why this history is important is it dispels all of those mythologies. It basically lets us know that as a people, we do have a very proactive role in our liberation struggle. We're people who actually have a history. We're people who come from ancestors who didn't just sit around to wait to be liberated. We came from a people who actually fought and resisted and rebelled, and ultimately were able to liberate themselves, were able to emancipate themselves. And that's why I stress the fact that the abolition of slavery wasn't something that was just handed to ancestors. Their ancestors, whether they were in the United States, South America, or the Caribbean islands, waged a continuous struggle against slavery until it was abolished, until they put the slave masters in a situation where the alternative was to either free these people or to basically risk a repeat of what happened in Haiti when Africans were actually able to lead a successful revolution and completely overturn the plantation system. And in Ghana, that was actually the objective that Cuffy was going for when he led his rebellion. One of the interesting features about the Berbice rebellion was the fact that at the time that the revolution was taking place, Cuffy actually declared independence for I think we lost our host.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry
Okay, you're
about
back.
that. Yeah, some type of technical difficulties.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So what I was about to explain is, one of the interesting features about the Berbice rebellion is that Cuffy actually declared independence from the Dutch. That he,
Wow.
what the Haitian Revolution later did is what he was attempting to do by not only fighting to liberate his people from slavery, but fighting to create an actual independent Black society, an independent republic. And he was actually governor. He declared himself governor of the society that he established. So part of why this history is important is it shows that the vision for our ancestors wasn't merely just fighting to end slavery. The
Right.
vision for ancestors was self-determination.
Yeah.
It was actually building independent societies that we control, that we govern. And as I pointed out, if we don't know this history, then it creates a situation where we think we come from a people who very passively accepted being enslaved, the people who didn't have this grander vision for self-determination. But to me, I can speak, from my personal experience. It's very empowering learning about coffee. It's very empowering, learning that I came from a people who, and my father made this point very clear to me about coming from a people who had this rebellious spirit. Coming from people who were able to endure the type of inhumane suffering that African people endured and rose above it. To me, it's very empowering. So for people who don't know this history, you're losing out on the ability to really connect with the ancestral spirit. You're losing out on the ability to connect with that spirit of rebellion, connect with the spirit of determination that allows us to rise above the obstacles that our ancestors have faced and allows us to have the courage and determination to rise above the obstacles that we face.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, I'm sorry once again that technical difficulty. Watching, the link is in the description. The link is in the chat. You can tap in and be part of the conversation. I vividly recall you discussed Malcolm X. He talked about if you believe you come from a legacy of non-achievement, you're more than likely to be groomed psychologically that you can't achieve anything. This isn't just Malcolm X bloviating or grandstanding politically in terms of his activism. One of the canonical pieces of the literature, canonical text in the field of Africana studies, is Charles Mill's book, The Racial Contract. He's from the Caribbean as well. He's Jamaican. He talked about that very issue his text, and he talked about why this was done. And the goal was to once again destroy. And matter of fact, if I can, I'm going to actually pull this up and read um, a snippet from, of course, his book. And as you know, this was part of really the foundation of my dissertation, right? From one doctor to another. I'm quite sure you can appreciate that. So let me see if I can pull this up very quickly. But he talks about that very issue, and really building on uh, some of the work and thoughts of course, Marcus Garvey as well. When Marcus Garvey talked about propaganda. So if I remember here, he talks about the effect of the culture bomb. And of course, he's citing the Kenyan, of course, activist, educator, and author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who we know transitioned last year in May to the realm of the ancestors. He actually was here in the States. He was in Georgia where he transitioned. They talk about the effects. He talks about the culture bomb of British imperialism. Of course, this is just colonial education, etc., miseducation, which prohibit them learning their oral tradition of Kikuyu. He says the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief, in their names, in their language, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement. It makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. So we're talking about self-abnegation here. Racism as an ideology needs to be understood as aiming at the minds of non-whites as well as whites, inculcating subjugation. If the social contract requires that all citizens, persons learn to respect themselves and each other, the racial contract prescribes non-white self-loathing and racial deference to whites. White citizens, the ultimate triumph of this education is that it eventually becomes possible to characterize the racial contract as consensual and voluntaristic, even for non-whites. So we see this self-perpetuating type of behavior that is, of course, learned from generation to generation. as a result of course, being miseducated. So once again, families, we know this is the Pan African platform. We understand that the issues that we face here in the good old U.S. of A., right, and I say that with tongue in cheek, right, are analogous to the issues that our brothers and sisters experience in the Caribbean, South America, Africa, then of course in throughout even Europe and Asia as well. These are issues that we're facing globally. And I think it's important as a Pan African, so we always let people know that these are issues that are connected by a global form of anti-black racism.
And that's actually I'm glad you made that point, because part of what shaped my own development as a Pan-Africanist was actually learning about the history of Cuffy, learning about the history of that rebellion, and then eventually learning that African Americans here waged a similar struggle against slavery. So the first time I ever heard about Nat Turner, my mind immediately went to Cuffy, and I started putting together the fact that African people here in the States were fighting against slavery at the same time that African people in the Caribbean were waging a struggle against slavery. So that rebellion in Berbice, definitely was something that helped to shape my understanding of Pan Africanism and shape my understanding of the fact that all of these struggles are interconnected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, family, so tap in, be part of the conversation. We're back with our mini series, Lessons from History, honoring the moral obligation to remember. And of course, we're honoring the Cuffy Rebellion that took place in Dutch Guyana, 23 February 1763, right? So we're pushing back against the prevaricating narrative that we passively accepted slavery, that this was actually a civilizing mission that was to benefit us. We know that, of course, is completely false. And so we want you to tap in, be part of the convo, share with us what you've learned. Put a one in the chat if you are familiar with the Kufi Rebellion. Put a two in the chat if you are not familiar with the rebellion. And we have, of course, our own Ghanaian Pan Africans with us, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Dwayne Omawale, here with us. And so we definitely want to give thanks for him. But I'm going to make some edits very quickly, make sure we put some respect on his name. Yeah, so we're going to change that up. We have it there, Dr. Dwayne Omawale. So we definitely holding it down the way we should. But I think it's important that we learn about these type of rebellions. In fact, coming up in less than a week, we're going to, of course, on March 1st, we're going to actually be honoring the War of the Golden Stool. So if you're unfamiliar with what many people consider and call the Ya Asantewaa War, then you definitely want to be here for that, where we're once again honoring the moral obligation to remember. If I remember correctly, the sister from Mississippi, who was a member of the Mississippi Democratic Party. She was a sharecropper. Her name is missing me right now.
Fannie Lou Hamer.
Fannie Lou Hamer. She's the one who taught us, never forget where you come from, and always praise the bridges that carry you over. So we definitely want to praise the bridge of our ancestors' agency. And as you said, it inspired you. You feel that spirit is part of who you are and allows you to move forward as well. And I always make sure that I honor my ancestors, and actually oftentimes ask them for their strength, for their valor, for their agency, for their stubborn, dogged determination when I'm facing, of course, challenges myself. So it's extremely important for me to be African-centered. Most people who know me know I've been this way since I was a mere tyke, right? And so this is natural for me, but I think it's always important for us to, of course, push this information out, communicate this information. And I think you are even familiar. I had a conversation with you that when I was, of course, the director of the MLK Center, that our philosophy or our theme for the year was our culture is our immune system. And of course, there were some challenges, some pushback regarding how can you make your culture your immune system. And of course, we're shouting out the sister who wrote the book, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, right? I don't want to butcher her name because I can't think of it off the top of my head. Sister Mariana Ani, I believe that's her name, doctor. But one of the things she talks about, one of the things we know is that it's very simple if you have a working knowledge of African diaspora history and culture. So this is a way for us to, of course, provide that. And just, a little cheat code. Of course, I am connected, linked to the Omawale online library, the Omawale Pan-African Digital Library. So I'm actually going to pull this up very quickly, family, so that you all can see this, because I think it's important that we give people the opportunity to know that this information is out there. So you may not be in a position to purchase literature, family, but as you can see here, we have the Omawale Digital Library. So if you are interested in of course, researching, learning more about African diaspora history, that you can see the movement for restoring the African mind. This is the place to be, right? And we have archives going all the way back to October of 2019. So our brother, Dr. Dwayne Omawale, he does his due diligence. And there's a litany of literature on the subject matter. I would argue almost anything you could think of. You could type it in, and of course, it will come up. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. You mind if I put this information in the chat, Brother Dwayne?
Not all. I didn't realize you were using my library like that.
Oh, come on now. Come on now. I mean, if you're Jordan, I'm Kobe. I'm going to steal your moves. You know what I'm saying? Absolutely. So we're going to put the link in the chat, family.
Appreciate
I'm
it.
going to post that on my page as well. What do you say?
I appreciate it. And actually, in that library, there's a good documentaries broken up into 3 parts. That's on the Berbice uprising.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there you go, family. Once again, put a 1 in the chat if you are familiar with the Berbice Rebellion, the Cuffy Rebellion in Dutch Guyana. Put a 2 in the chat if you are unfamiliar. Once again, you're watching LumumbaSpeaks.com, Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. We're back once again with another live from our series honoring the moral obligation to remember, lessons from history, and we're honoring the Cuffy Rebellion that took place 23 February 1763. So we definitely want to make sure that we're always betting on Black and honoring the legacy of our ancestors. I, of course, was unfamiliar with the Cuffy Rebellion until last year. I started doing research on slave revolts here in the Western world because I wanted to build, of course, a knowledge base for this, of course, playlist that I have, where a series that we have where we discuss, of course, lessons from history. And so I had to do my due diligence as well. And of course, that is, of course, is a result of the miseducation machine. Even if you have a PhD like such as myself, and you get degrees in African studies, but you don't go in depth, right, in terms of all the resistance and how consistent it particularly was here in the Western world, but even, of course, in the Middle Passage, and even on the continent. So it's something that I think we need to be aware of. And as you all know, now I will share with this with you all later, but I'm working on a book, right? And so when that drops, you all will be the first to know. So definitely giving thanks for that. I think my screen is frozen up.
Yeah, I can hear you though, but the screen is frozen.
Okay. So we have some technical difficulties once again. Might be time for me to buy a new laptop. that may be the issue. But final thoughts, brother, regarding what we should take from the Cuffy Rebellion. So let me ask you this question. What type of military strategies did they use during the rebellion and revolt?
Great question, actually, because that's what I was going to get into, that one of the reasons why the revolt wasn't successful is the limitation that they ran into was the fact that, as I pointed out, the objective was to declare independence and to create an independent state. But the problem was, after declaring this independent state, they realized they didn't have access to gunpowder for the firearms. So they were able to, take the firearms, take the weapons from the slave masters, and in some situations, Cuffy actually set up workstations to repair and to produce firearms. But the problem was that he didn't have gunpowder, so it put him in a situation where he couldn't continuously wage a military struggle against the Dutch. So it forced him into a position where he had to engage in negotiations with the Dutch, and that put him in a very difficult situation because, as I pointed out, not only was he in a circumstance where he couldn't wage a continued struggle because of the fact that he didn't have gunpowder, but it also put him in a situation where the generals who were under his leadership began to question his leadership because they didn't trust the Europeans that he was engaging in negotiations with. So because of the fact that they didn't trust that the negotiations would actually lead to something that was productive, they didn't trust the people who enslaved them, it weakened Cuffy's position in the resistance movement. It put him in a situation where the generals who were serving under him began to question his leadership, began to question his authority. So really, the fact that the rebels didn't have consistent access to gunpowder weakened their position in the revolutionary struggle. It weakened their ability to wage a continuous struggle, and it weakened Cuffy's position of authority as leader in the rebellion, and that created divisions within the movement that ultimately led to the collapse of that rebellion.
Interesting. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear any of that, but it's quite all right.
Uh,
Quite all right. So,
but the,
but
the,
I,
the
when I
view
do
is good, though. I guess that's the most important
I'm
part.
sorry.
So the listeners did, so I think that's the most
Yes,
important part.
that's what matters most. So, and if I remember correctly from what I read, Kufi committed suicide.
Okay, so you came in at the perfect point because I was just explaining why he started losing his control over leadership. So the next part that happened was there was actually a rebellion, an outright rebellion against his leadership. And when he realized that he lost control over the generals that he was leading, he opted to commit suicide. And the reason why he did it is part of West African military tradition. You know, in some West African cultures, that as a leader, if your leadership and your authority is rejected, that's what was expected of you. I think the
Right.
most famous example of that is the Oyo Empire in West Africa. If the ruling king was rejected, then the alternative
Democratic leadership. Yeah.
you have to commit suicide.
Interesting. Interesting. So that,
So
that would be another example of course, the African cultural remnant here in the New World when people make this claim that no, we were indigenous, we're the Indians, and so on and so forth. That would be an argument that one could make that highlights that that is not the case.
you know the interesting thing about that pertaining to this history, the other part of why the rebellion failed, in addition to the internal struggles and the divisions that emerged among the rebels, was the fact that the indigenous population, or what we call in Ghana Amerindians, American Indians, the Amerindians actually sided with the Dutch in terms of helping them put down the rebellion. And then when the rebellion was
Wow.
crushed, the enslaved Africans who decided to escape and fled and were hiding, the Amerindians were actually used to track them down and to bring them into the opposition of the Dutch. So, in addition to fighting against the Europeans, the African rebels in the Berbice uprising also had to fight against the Amerindians.
But I thought we were Native Americans. We were Indians.
Yeah. And I mean that's even relevant to the history here in the States. And a lot of the people who claim that they're Indians don't like
Right.
to talk about the fact that the so-called five civilized tribes actually had slaves as well.
Absolutely. Yes, they did.
So
Absolutely.
that's an aspect of the history of African relations with Native Americans. I think it's uncomfortable to discuss, but it is reality that in many situations, Indigenous Americans actually sided with the Europeans against us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So once again, family, the link is in the description. Link is in the chat. I do apologize for having the technical difficulties that we're having today. This is the first time this has happened, but we will look to see what we can do to address that issue. Once again, make sure you go to omawalebooks.wordpress.com and have access to the, of course, online digital Pan African library. And once again, family, if you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. You are, of course, watching LumumbaSpeaks.com in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan African social media extraordinaire and the home of African centered news and information. And if you could be a blessing, make sure you hit the Cash App, Super Chat, and of course, PayPal and Venmo. We have a quote here from Brother Jay: "You can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree itself." Absolutely, we know Malcolm X, unfortunately, was taken from us 3 days ago. 61 years ago in 3 days, he was taken from us. But we know the teachings and the legacy of Malcolm X, of course, is still with us. And so I think that is something that we always want to make sure that we honor and respect. Of course, Malcolm, who taught us that we are Africans living in America, right? We're not Americans living in Africa. So definitely want to give thanks, Brother Malcolm, for giving us that African-centered consciousness. He, of course, was a Pan-Africanist. Many people oftentimes overlook that. We know there's a lot of misinformation about Malcolm X and his political views and ideology in his last days. But we know, of course, he created the Organization of African American Unity. It was modeled after the Organization of African Unity, which is now the African Union. And of course, Malcolm stated in a speech that this would be the first time since Garvey that brothers and sisters in the States were looking to make ties and connections with the African continent. So he was very much aware of that Pan-African history as well. So we definitely want to give thanks to the leadership, charisma, valor, and courage of course, our shining Black Prince, Malcolm X.
And I think something that's important to add as well, considering that not too long ago Jesse Jackson transitioned, that a misconception is he's the one that invented the term African American. Malcolm was using African American in the '60s before
This is
Jesse
true.
Jackson made it popular.
And of course, T. Thomas Fortune And John Edward Brooks, they even created an organization called the Afro-American Organization in the 1890s, right? So the term has been around for a very long time. We even have documentation from the New York Times in the 1700s in which Black people in America were referred to as African Americans. So don't believe, once again, the prevaricating narrative that this is a rather recent term. And I, of course, here at, of course, the Movement Speaks, we use the term African American rather than Black American. We know that African Americans are the only racial or ethnic group in America that are denoted or identified by a color and not a geographical place of origin. So we want to push back against that. We also know that, unfortunately, during the Holocaust of enslavement, according to Dr. Excuse me, what is his name? He's from Kenya. He transitioned Ali, Missouri. There was a process of deculturalization in which we were stripped of our African identities and given, of course, a racialized one. So we want to push back against that, the othering of African people, and of course, embrace that African identity, that African ties, African language, and of course, African centered world. So once again, Brother Jay, appreciate you tapping in. Put a one in the chat if you're familiar with the Kufi Rebellion. Put a two in the chat if you were unfamiliar. Once again, you also can tap in and be part of the conversation if needed and necessary. We'd love to hear what you have to say here on the 24th day of Pan-African History Month. Many of you may be questioning, why do I call it Pan-African History Month? And I might do a show titled, Is Black History Month only for African Americans, right? Because there are a lot of people arguing that, no, this is just for African Americans. But I even had an exchange with a brother on social media, on Facebook. And I said, well, what is rather curious about your position is that Dr. Carter G. Woodson specifically stated, and I quote, that he created Negro History Week, which later became Black History Month, so that Black people could learn about our great past in Africa, right? So that we would know that we have a legacy of accomplishment to be proud of. So I'm just saying, something to, of course, consider. Oftentimes, this type of insular, and I'm gonna use the term that you taught me long ago, narrow nationalism, right? It's actually more, I think it's extremely problematic where we're actually looking at each other as enemies rather than those who actually seek to, of course, do harm to African people and make African life as difficult as possible. We also know that a lot of this is rooted in Afrophobia, right? This inherent fear of being one, embracing oneself, one's culture, one's history, one's heritage. And I don't say this from a position in which I'm looking to be condescending, but I'm saying this from a position of someone who 20 years ago had experienced the same thing. I myself at one point was Afrophobic, even though I thought I was black-minded, right? So just something to consider. We know where much of this comes from, but we have a responsibility to, of course, to fight against all that seek to do harm to African life, and that is internal as well as external.
Yeah, so it's a great point because the problem that I've noticed every time Black History Month comes around is Carter G. Woodson for some reason gets erased in the narrative of what he created. So a lot of people who celebrate Black History Month have never actually read any of his books. And you made the point that when you read his writings, he doesn't start Black history with the history in the United States. He actually starts it in Africa. And there's actually, you were promoting my digital library. There's a book on that library by Carter G. Woodson, The Negro in Our History, that actually starts in Africa, and he goes over the history of particularly West Africa, where many of our ancestors came from. So he didn't view Black history in America as something that was just connected to America. He saw the history of people here as being connected to the global experiences of African people everywhere. And in that same book, a point that he actually makes is that many of the people who were enslaved in America came to the West Indies first, were enslaved in the West Indies, and then brought to the United States. So he was even making the point that there was a connection between slavery in the United States and slavery in the West Indies, and that many of the enslaved in the West Indies came to the United States. So he was always clear in his writings that there's a connection among all of our histories, and he didn't try to segregate Black history in America to where it was disconnected from the history of African people elsewhere. And another point I want to add is that Carter G. Woodson was a Pan-Africanist as well. He worked with Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and I think an aspect of Woodson's history that a lot of people don't know about is that Woodson actually wrote for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, and his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, initially started as a series of articles that were first published in Garvey's newspaper before he published it in a book format.
Wow. And I didn't know that. So absolutely. So something to consider when we're having those conversations. But once again, this is why I say he's your favorite historian's favorite historian, your favorite Pan Africanist, favorite Pan Africanist, none other than brother, Dr. Dwayne Omawale. This is why, family, I tell you all, he's my Pan African big brother. And I'm always giving him his flowers. And he could say he's smiling because he knows I say this to him offline, not just
Yep.
online, but offline. We probably talk probably at least once a week, sometimes maybe three, four, five times, six times a week. And I consistently give this brother his flowers publicly and of course privately because he to me is just he's a jewel. He's inspired me. He's the reason why I've started publishing books. I'm working on another book that is extremely academic, but I think it's going to be a banger, family. And I definitely hope that you all can support that when that project is completed. But these are the type of things that we need to know. One of the things that I discussed when I wrote my article on Medium, which once again I write on Medium thanks to what Brother Dwayne Omawale. I wrote an article titled "I'm Blacker Than You." And I talked about this. A lot of this FBA, ADOS, these diaspora wars are all rooted in really the same issue that got our ass over here in the first place: divide and conquer. Right? I can recall there was a brother from I think. Uh, Guinea-Bissau. And this is the same thing that happened 100 years ago. We haven't learned our lesson yet, right? So we know that there are brothers and sisters on the continent, the Caribbean, and even here in the States who are aware of how problematic these ideologies, these groups are. And we want to push back against that and advocate unity and helping each other develop and have, really having a really being able to positively materially improve our conditions in life in any way that we can. Legally, not illegally, because got some people out there that be trapping, but we don't advocate that. But definitely want to make sure that information is out there. So once again, family, if you're watching, once again, tap in. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. Come be part of the conversation. Once again, if you are familiar with the Cuffy Rebellion, put a 1 in the chat. If you're not familiar, you can put a 2 in the chat. And of course, on March 1st, we're going to have, of course, our next video, our next live in our Lessons in History series, where we're going to be, of course, teaching and discussing the Ya Asantewaa War, also known as the War of the Golden Stool. So definitely want you all to just tap in for that. But that when you ask that question, was it a success? It depends, right? Was, of course, the Asante Kingdom colonized? Yes. Did the British successfully obtain the Golden Stool? No. So there's a number of conversations that can be had about what success looked like. But what we also know is that irrespective of where African people are, we've always resisted, right? And I think that's what is most important. We've never, acquiesced. We've never capitulated. We never laid down and said, listen, you have dominated us and we're going to accept that willingly. So just want to make sure, family, that you all are aware of this. And just give thanks for you all tapping in. Apologize that it's been quite a while since we went live, but we're going to look to be far more consistent moving forward. Till next time, family, y'all know what to do. Well, before we end, Brother Dwayne, I want to give you a chance for last words.
I think just want to go back to what I was saying before, and I think you might have cut out when I was explaining the details, but to go back to the point that you were discussing about the problem of division. As I explained, that's part of the reason why the Berbice uprising failed, was the divisions that began to emerge among the rebel leaders of that uprising. And as you pointed out, it resulted in Cuffy taking his life when he realized that he didn't have the support and the following that he needed. But subsequently, what happened after Cuffy was taken out is that the leaders that were left didn't really have his leadership quality. They didn't have his organizing ability. So basically, due to the internal divisions, they took out the person who was the most capable of really leading that rebellion and ensuring the success of that rebellion. So just reinforces the fact that division is something that continues to hinder our progress as people, something that continues to hinder our ability to resist. And it's something we see all throughout our history. As we pointed out, it's the reason why we even got over here in the first place. If the Europeans came into Africa and confronted a united front in Africa, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So throughout our history, there's always been a problem of our enemies being able to exploit the divisions among us as a people and those divisions weakening our ability to resist and to rebel. But as I made the point before, when we're engaged in the process of the work that we're doing now, we are continuing the legacy of the ancestors who did rebel. We're continuing the legacy of the ancestors who did engage in acts of resistance. So that's why understanding this history is important. And the other point, which I didn't mention before, about why understanding and teaching this history is important, is we owe it to our ancestors. Our ancestors waged these struggles so that we could be able to be in the spaces that we're in now, to have the freedoms that we have now, to have these conversations. And I think I was having a conversation with a brother recently about how oftentimes we take these freedoms for granted. We take for granted the ability that we could, just jump on a platform like YouTube and have these discussions publicly and not be concerned that the Klan is going to show up at our front door tomorrow because we were engaged in these type of discussions.
So,
with a period of time in this country where African people having these type of discussions in a public forum, that was going to be the response. The Klan was going to show up, and we talked about Malcolm. That's exactly what happened to Malcolm's father. The Klan didn't the activities that he was engaged in. So I think just out of respect for our ancestors and their struggles, and the fact that their struggles gave us some freedoms. And I make that point because it's very difficult to appreciate the freedoms that we have, considering that African people globally still face a multitude of problems that we're struggling through. So I don't want the struggles that we're facing now to cause us to lose sight of the fact that we've made tremendous progress in a number of ways. So I think we owe it to our ancestors to continue to speak about their struggles, to continue to honor them, and continue to let people know that the reason why we exist as we do, and the reason why we're in the position that we are as a people in terms of what we've been able to overcome and the advancements that we've been able to make, is due to the sacrifices of our ancestors.
Absolutely. Appreciate you, brother. Until next time, family, y'all know what to do. Always bet on Black. Peace. Before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you for supporting the channel. And remember, here at Lumumba Speaks, we always bet on Black. Peace.